Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
I don't know if you saw the quivering buttocks unveiled in the House of Commons yesterday, but I observed yesterday morning that the maddest stories in the news would not be the April Fools yesterday. Little did I know that there would be a nude demonstration in Westminster before close of play. And speaking of things that I never thought would happen, today the Daily Mail provides what is probably the best roundup of the government's own analysis of how the country would be affected by a no-deal Brexit. And that is, in a sense, where we are. The government's own analysis is bleak. It won't be infallible. Some of the stuff that they say will happen won't happen. Some of the stuff that does happen will be worse than what they fear. And some of it will be nowhere near as bad. That is humanity. That is life. Anything else is denial. Denial, denial, denial. And so it continues. What is the one thing that we could all agree on almost as soon as the dust began to settle? It was that the seductive qualities of an invitation not to have to explain things was overpowering. It began with Brexit means Brexit, or leave means leave, or take back control. All of these invitations, which were taken up with alacrity and enthusiasm by millions of lovely people, all of these invitations proved irresistible to millions of people. The minute you write it down, it falls apart. So don't write it down. Chequers got written down. It fell apart. Customs Union yesterday was sort of written down and almost fell apart. The withdrawal agreement, written down, fell apart. Whether she gets support for it tomorrow, only time will tell. Goodness knows now how things unfold, because it's got nothing to do with facts. It's got nothing to do with evidence. It's got nothing to do with things that you can read and understand, and everything to do with the whim and whimsy of human beings, some of whom are so spectacularly ill-equipped to address this epic moment in our national history that I find myself wondering how on earth they ever got selected in the first place. And then you glance towards Dominic Grieve's constituency, where UKIP entryists, led by a former pantomime producer, have managed to pass a vote of no confidence in one of the most revered and esteemed parliamentarians in Westminster. And you suddenly understand how these people get selected. I don't know where the blame lies, ultimately, for populating Parliament with political pygmies, but it has to lie, in large part, with constituency associations on both sides. You saw what happened to Luciana Berger up in Liverpool. It's an astonishing... it's a flaw in our democracy, but no one claims that any democracy is perfect. But a flaw in our democracy is the amount of power that can be wielded by a relatively small number of arrivistes in any constituency association. We saw it with militant tendency in the 1980s, and we're seeing it with, I don't know what they describe themselves as, Spartans, is it? In conservative associations today. Just these are some examples. As I say, they may not turn out to be true. They may turn out to be optimistic, or they may turn out to be unduly pessimistic. But if you've stopped listening to Britain's highest-ranking civil servant, you have stopped listening, full stop. Your fingers are inserted so far into your ears that your ears are now redundant, as are your eyes. The people were told not to trust the evidence of their own eyes and ears. It was the party's final, most important command. And now you have the country's highest-ranking civil servant telling us that there would be enormous pressure on the government to bail out companies on the brink. Businesses and households without access to frictionless EU trade would struggle to get credit. Unlike in 2008, our recession would be a local one, not an international one. This would make currency depreciation more harmful. We believe there would be significant disruption in the short term. Food prices would increase by up to 10%, with steeper rises in fresh produce prices. The UK would forfeit access to criminal justice levers. None of our mitigation measures would give the UK the same security capabilities as our current ones. The UK UK would be less safe as a result. Our national security would be disrupted. The stability of union would be dislocated. And the current powers granted to the Northern Irish Secretary would not be adequate for the pace, breadth or controversy of the decisions needed to be taken through a no-deal Brexit. Therefore, we would have to introduce direct rule. And still, if you were to turn on your television now, you will find somebody like Marc Francois claiming simultaneously that he knows what he's talking about and that there is somehow nothing to fear. And that heady draft still intoxicates significant swathes of the population. How can it not when it goes unchallenged? How can it not be seductive and successful when you see somebody whose expertise has been derided and dismissed, like Ken Clarke, being treated with the same levels of authority and respect by national broadcasters as an absolute plum like Marc Francois? It's quite incredible. A man who bases his opposition to the European Union on the fact that his father fought in the Second World War and beat the Germans, while conveniently failing to mention that his mother is Italian and was therefore, under his ludicrously Second World War revivalist worldview, on the losing side. And so it continues at 9 minutes after 10. That's the bottom line. It seems to me that the antidote to binary thinking is compromise. So it's very important to say that Mark Sedwill's analysis will not be perfect. It will not be 100% accurate. Some of the things he warns of will not happen. Some of the things he warns of perhaps involve warnings that have not gone far enough, because this is humanity now. This is unknowable. Predictable, but not infallibly predictable. And that's where we are. I've got two starters for 10 this morning. One, I suspect, even for the somewhat evolved tastes of regular listeners to this programme, is too anaraki, actually. This first one probably won't work. It also needs a little bit of work in the setup that obviously I am poised to do. The second is really easy. If things continue as they are, and we crash out with no deal in circumstances that a relatively small coterie of extremely well-insulated, wealthy individuals insist would be okay, but which almost everybody else in business insists would not, I do want to know what would happen to you that day. Do you know? I've got friends in business. I'm not in business, all right? I get up in the morning, I get into a car, I get driven to work, I talk to you, I walk out of the studio, I get on public transport and I go home. So of all the things listed here that might impact upon me, food prices is probably going to be the most worrying. Arguably, given that I'm on a good whack and in quite a good place at the moment, arguably I could come out of this better off than I would have done if we remained, because if credit is really, really hard to get, then people who've got a bit of capital in place are presumably going to be able to snap up all sorts of assets at knock-down prices if things go really bad. I think you might have to start feeding the kids Fray Bentos pies instead of delicious organics, but I think somebody like me who is providing a service that is not exported is best placed in many ways to survive the mess. But I've got friends that are greengrocers. I've got, in fact, a big shout out to Ron in Putney, who has the cart down in Putney on the high street there. You made a grave error, Ron, on Saturday when he said in earshot of my 10-year-old daughter that broccoli was one of the first casualties of the Calais protests. Fresh broccoli was not available during that Calais protest because it was perishing before it got to Britain. Well, a 10-year-old daughter is not what you would call fully politicised at this point in proceedings, and I'm very careful when the front door closes not to import all of the angst and stress of domestic politics to my home life, but she did, I said, sort of little eyes lit up at the thought of there being no broccoli as a result of Brexit. But that's probably not a reason to support no deal. So I know greengrocers, I know people that work in pension funds who've just quietly been reporting to me for a couple of months that they're shifting huge amounts of money out of the country. It might come back. I don't understand that world enough They tell me it won't. They said there's no point in bringing it back. There's nothing that's going to happen that will make the circumstances here preferable to the circumstances in Frankfurt. Or I don't even really fully understand what it means when they say they're moving money from London to Frankfurt. But I remember Rees-Mogg, of course, opening 2 funds in Dublin. So it must be for the same reason. If we crash out with no deal, then having your money outside of the European Union will, for a wide variety of investments, become unfavourable. It will become suboptimal. Obviously, if your investments are in countries that don't have any arrangements with the European Union, it would be less true. But I don't understand enough about that world to turn it into a pithy little slogan and stick it on the side of a bus. You see a headline in the Financial Times that says £1 trillion has already gone, and you appreciate Dominic Cummings' diabolical genius. £1 trillion is too much to get cross about. We don't understand the concept of £1 trillion. 350 million quid on the side of a bus with the words NHS or the letters NHS 10 foot high next to it. That's clever. We can get our teeth into something like that. £1 trillion of institutional investments moving out of the... We can't get our head around that. So, I haven't done the Anaraki one, and it's already nearly past. So let's start with that. Hand on heart, what happens to you and your business the morning after we crash out with no deal? I've forgotten what date it is. That's how embedded I am in this story at the moment. Over March the 29th in my mind has not yet been superseded. It'd be the end of next week, would it? I think. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. April the 12th is the day upon which we are due to leave. So what happens on 13th, 14th, 15th, April the 15th? I'm presuming that you're not open for business on April the 13th, but if you are, please feel free to ring in and tell me what actually happens. Do you know? Because I don't know what will happen to me. I optimistically think that because I don't rely on raw materials, I don't need to import anything from France to come to work in the morning and do my job. I rely mostly on public transport or private hire to get around the place. What's going to happen to me? I mean, I don't want to be less secure. I don't want the union to be dislocated. I don't want direct rule in Ulster, which might revivify Irish Republican terrorism. That might affect me at some point down the line, but I'm not going to get spooked about it now. But if I was flogging broccoli on Putney High Street, or if I was importing industrial chimneys from Germany to put onto building sites in a just-in-time supply chain, or if I was working on a car production line that has, 3 minutes wiggle room either way, if the just-in-time supply chain is in any way disrupted, then production stops. And if production stops, no Japanese chief executive is going to stick around. What happens to you on the morning of April the 15th? 0345 6060 973. And then we'll have a go at the Turkey question, because I'll tell you after this. I have an absolute humdinger of a question for you if you were persuaded by the scaremongering surrounding Turkey joining the European Union to vote to leave the European Union. That was one of the ugliest episodes, wasn't it, in the whole saga, one from which Boris Johnson and Michael Gove are unable, I'm afraid, to remove their fingerprints. They were both neck deep in that deception. But the argument was, we've got to leave because Turkey's about to join. And then in brackets, obviously, you're supposed to fill in the gaps yourself. And Turkey's full of Muslims. So how come then they're still saying, the same people are saying, that if we joined or if we stayed in a customs union with the European Union, then that wouldn't be like leaving at all, because Turkey's in a customs union with the European Union, and the prospect of them joining was used to frighten the horses in the referendum campaign. So is Turkey in the European Union or not? The answer is it isn't, but it's in the customs union. So how can people then say, being in the customs union isn't really leaving? Because then Turkey's in the European Union, which it isn't. So every time you think that you've cracked a conundrum of such utter perfection that surely everybody who fell for this con will now see the light, you realise that it doesn't work like that. Not when facts are on one side and feelings are on the other. I feel that it's not like leaving the European Union, but we'd be like Turkey. And you literally use Turkey as the example of a country not in the European Union seeking to be in the European Union, leaving aside for the moment that was a whole load of hot air that is, on current terms, never going to happen. Leave that aside for the moment. How can the thought of Turkey joining the European Union be terrifying, but also their current terms of membership of the customs union be practically the same as being in the European Union anyway? I remember when moments like that, moments of clarity like that, used to make me feel optimistic about pennies dropping and pendulums swinging and light bulbs coming on across the nation. Oh, yes, I'd never thought of it like that. I used to think you would think, but I don't anymore. John's in Leeds. John, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James.
Hello, John.
I just wanted to say, thank you. I just wanted to say that in the event that no deal actually does come about, me and my wife actually have had serious discussions about potentially looking to move away from the UK.
Can I ask why? I mean, in more specific terms, rather than...
Of course. Yes, of course. Basically, we have 3 young children at the moment, all under 6, and we're just concerned that basically the fact that they wouldn't have the same opportunity that we would, and that, quite frankly, I think a no-deal Brexit would lead to generally a decline in the nation as a whole, economically, culturally. I just don't see a positive.
I think I'm supposed to say at this point, in the interest of balance, it will only be short-term, and you say, do you have any evidence for that prediction? And I say, no, none at all, but it's the fig leaf that they've given me, and it's the soundbite I keep repeating unchallenged on the BBC. There may be some short-term economic damage. It may be... In 100 years, people will look back and say it was the best thing we ever did as a nation, by which point I suspect none of us will be here.
Indeed, and the fact is, well, maybe so. I mean, I think even Jacob Rees-Mogg said at one point you wouldn't see the benefits for, 50 years
yes.
or so. So, to be frank, I'm afraid that's not really good enough in terms of trying to raise a family, getting jobs.
You must have to, you have a mobile skill set, do you? You have sort of languages and things like that? I'm not sort of pulling at the threads of your possible plans, but it's a rather bigger deal than perhaps either of us are acknowledging at this point.
Indeed, absolutely. No, it is, and it's something serious. I do potentially have a mobile skill set. Some business skills I'm learning at the moment.
Yes.
But, as is my partner. So the option would be there, especially with remote working, those kinds of things, to potentially be based in another country.
The problem is, of course, that you're not going to have freedom of movement. So where would you move to?
Well, you can apply for citizenship.
You can apply for. You can do all of the things that the Leavers told us couldn't be done. As a member of the European Union, you could be required to have a job in place or proof of income, or afforded 3 months to find a job, and at the end of which you would have to come back to Britain. But yes, well, it's not a. I mean, it's a bleak picture that you paint, one that I hope never comes to fruition. But in some ways, I envy your freedom, if that is how you feel. I sort of feel a lot more modern and outward-looking now than I did 3 years ago, but, I'm nearly 50, mate. I just don't know. The kids are the youngest starts secondary school in September. The roots have gone so deep, and I can't imagine that there's much call for English language, for monoglot broadcasters in polyglot countries. Karen is on the Black Isle. Karen, what's going on?
Good morning. Thank you for having my call.
You're very welcome.
Well, I have 2 jobs.
Yes.
And so one is my husband has a reheating business, and I see that folding within, I don't know, a year, maybe 2.
Why?
Simply because we're going to have to put up the prices by about 50%.
So is everybody else. I'm not being Pollyanna-ish here. I'm being a little bit devil's advocate-y. So
yes.
It's not as people need heating.
I appreciate that. I mean, I suspect the figure will be anywhere between 30 and 70%. But to give you a figure,
yes.
But because boiler parts come from Europe, and
yes.
The thing is, the wages, of course, everybody's wages are not going to rise to the same degree. So people are going to have to make a choice between having a boiler serviced or repaired or whatever. And, putting maybe food on the table. This heating or eating thing that a lot of old people suffer now is probably going to stretch a lot further. It's going to ripple far wider. And, I know you will probably attempt to argue that
You don't need to finish that sentence, Karen. You're completely right. I will, whatever you're about to say, I will almost certainly attempt to argue.
Especially in winter, but it's it's going to be difficult, simply because some people are maybe going to be able to afford it, and that's fine, but a lot of them won't be able to. So then it's a matter of us saying, right, shall we do this person's boiler even though we can't? We know he can't pay,
yes.
But we can't let him freeze to death. And then we'll hemorrhage money.
It falls
or
to
we'll
you.
say, we're not coming out because we know you can't pay, and then, of course, we've lost customers as well. And, so I suspect it will be not a swift downfall, but a very gradual
Well, I hope
one.
not.
And of course,
I obviously hope not. I mean,
I hope not as well. However, you have then as well the problem that it doesn't really matter if a heating boiler's pump is stuck in a queue at Calais or in Dover for 4 weeks in the summer. In winter, it really does matter.
I need to issue a reminder at this point that anybody listening to you and either through callousness or optimism, and both positions are plausible, saying, it won't be that bad, it won't be that bad. If they're leavers, if they are Brexiters, if they still think it was a good idea, then they're supposed to be telling you that things are going to get better for your husband's business, not just, it won't be that bad. That's what Brexit has become. It won't be that bad.
Yeah, good luck with that.
It's supposed to be better. It's supposed to be, your husband's going to have people queuing up for new boilers. There's going to be unicorn dung. Central heating is going to be the new jam. It's going to be magnificent. And of course, the pound will get smacked around a bit, so even if the prices of the boilers coming in from Europe didn't get hit with tariffs and what have you, your pound is going to go less far than it would have done previously. Any silver linings, Karen?
Well, of sorts. I kind of echo your caller who was on before me, who was saying that he's thinking of moving away.
It's not a silver lining. It means we're going to be waving goodbye to all the nice people and drowning in a sea of gammon.
I'm sorry, you'll have to just come with us, won't you?
You might have to.
I was in Belgium last month, at the beginning of last month, and I have a job where I could start tomorrow.
Well, that's what a fire escape looks like. That's what an escape route looks like. And if you're listening to Karen and saying it won't be that bad, do remember you're supposed to be telling her how things are going to be better than they currently are. They've all stopped doing that. Have you noticed? All they've got now is, it won't be that bad. What happened to the sunny uplands? The sunlit uplands? What happened to the having your cake and eat it? What happened to all those wonderful things we were promised? And if you want to have a go at my turkey conundrum, I'll be eternally grateful to you. I'll talk you through the terms and conditions again shortly. Shall I squeeze in Jonathan in Liverpool? We don't have time to do that. I shall take Jonathan in Liverpool's call first, which gives me time to do the turkey terms and conditions. If you are persuaded that voting to leave the European Union meant support for a no-deal Brexit, I said last July that things were probably going to shake down to no deal versus no Brexit. And the people who were most dismissive of that, I have to tell you, were the people who are now pretending that they were in favour of no deal all along. The people who said, don't be ridiculous, of course the EU will blink, they need us more than we need them, the German car industry, why, they're still saying it. I think it was last July is the earliest we can find of me explaining why, if things carry on as they are, it's hard to see any way out of this that isn't either no deal or no Brexit. And all of the people most dismissive of that suggestion are now, as we also, I think, predicted, pretending that this is what they wanted all along. The Vote Leave pamphlet says we will not leave before we have negotiated an agreement. That's what it actually said on that pamphlet by the cheats what won. We're now all pretending that never happened. And when you say, these things might be bad, the response of people who once said things are going to be brilliant is now, well, things might not be that bad. It's 10:30. You kind of find your fun where you can these days, can't you? Can you believe that this man is one of the maypoles around which the mad, hard Brexit lobby dances?
How are you feeling tonight?
Well, everybody knows I'm Brexit hardman Steve Baker, as far as I'm aware.
Go on, I might. Can we just play that on a loop until Sheila gets here at 1 o'clock? You wonder why we're in this mess. Here's your answer.
How are you feeling tonight?
Well, everybody knows I'm Brexit hardman Steve Baker, as far as I'm aware.
Oh, go on, I'm on small.
How are you feeling tonight?
Well, everybody knows I'm Brexit hardman Steve Baker, as far as I'm aware.
I'm Brexit hardman Steve Baker. Mark Francois rattling his little toy sabre. Steve Baker describing himself as a Brexit hardman. Oh, go on, give me the trimmed version.
Well, everybody knows I'm Brexit hardman Steve Baker, as far as I'm aware.
we better dig out Swiss David Davis as well for later in the programme. And then you tell me which one's a parody and which one's actually a politician speaking in the shadow of Parliament. Oh, my days. What will no deal mean to you? Gabriel's in the construction industry, says, I'm really worried about no deal as we have most materials used imported from Europe. The lead time is generally 6 to 10 weeks now. It seems no deal will drive material prices up and therefore drive house prices up. Not good. Oh, the house price thing is a bit of a conundrum. Again, I am not an expert in such matters. I can see house prices coming down as a silver lining to affordability. But if house prices are coming down and the ordinary working person's income is also coming down, then house prices coming down will only be good news for people who can afford to buy houses, which will mean me, for example. I can buy your house at a knockdown price because of a no-deal Brexit. I might rent it back to you if you're very good. How much control does that feel like? Jonathan is in Liverpool. Jonathan, what will it mean to you?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
So I work in the agricultural industry. We import raw materials for animal feed, for dairy cows, essentially.
Yes.
And in the Brexit lead-up, I spoke with a lot of farmers who voted leave.
Yes, of course.
Because they were tired of all the red tape that Mr Farage is talking about, with the EU tying them up with milk quotas and slaughter prices and everything.
They've probably had the loudest wake-up call of anyone, haven't they, farmers?
Yeah, and I think one of the major things that I don't think, and from speaking to them recently, people have anticipated, is that virtually all of the raw materials that come into animal feed comes from or via Europe and via the EU.
Yes.
So everything is going to now be impacted by tariffs if we do go this way. And that means that all of the raw materials is going to be more expensive, which means that all of the feed is going to be more expensive. But we know already that the big supermarkets are very unlikely to increase the price of these agricultural products because these are the things that get people through the door. So farmers have, in a way, shot themselves in the foot in that sense without thinking of this.
And eventually the cost of food will go up. I understand what you're saying is that supermarkets won't pass it on to consumers immediately. They'll expect the suppliers to take the hit on it by paying less for what costs more, or paying the same despite the suppliers' costs going up. But eventually, and Mark Sedwill concurs on this, the Cabinet Secretary, in this 14-page letter sent out before today's Cabinet showdown, he predicts 10%. It may be in the short term, but steeper rises for fresh produce. So there's good news for who exactly, Jonathan, do you think, under this? I mean, even if I was a sinister plutocrat with pots of money invested in the detriment of my nation and the suffering of my fellow citizens, in your world, I can't see where I'd make a killing. Can you?
I can't see though, and a lot of farmers are already making a loss today at today's pricing. So the idea that prices will be going up in the future, a lot of farmers are already selling their milk products, for example, at less than it cost them to make it, and they're only surviving on the bonuses that are paid from the EU. And now that's going to be taken away, and the raw material prices going up, and also the fact, I mean, one of the arguments that Mr Farage always talks about is that the pound hasn't really changed since Brexit compared to the euro. But before Brexit, we were at an exchange rate of around about 1.4, and that very quickly dropped as the referendum was announced. And then since Brexit, there hasn't been a lot of movement in that exchange rate. But the fact is that the pound dropped because the referendum was called. And that's something that Mr Farage and his companions all very cleverly ignore and say that the pound hasn't really been affected by Brexit because the effect happened before.
Well, obviously, I'd rather put pins in my eyes and listen to the man, so I'll take your word for it. But the notion of there being something misleading or embellished or exaggerated is, let's just say, it's incredibly easy to believe, Jonathan. There is good news, mate. Brexit hard man Steve Baker's got your back.
I've heard. I'm quite scared, to be honest.
Wouldn't want to mess with him. 10:40 is the time. And by the way, if you want to get to Baker, you've got to go through Francois with his little toy sabre. Jamie is in Brisbane in Australia. Come off it, mate. You're going to be all right. You couldn't be further away from the action.
I've still got people I love and care for in the UK, James. I'm an expat. And what happens to me on the day of crashing out with no deal? Everything I've worked for 30 years that I've invested in Europe and the UK drops by 30%. My prediction as a business person and a business owner is that the pound will tumble, and that's why the trillions of dollars are going overseas. Because the thing is, if you move your money into a stable currency, and at the moment with all the turmoil that's happening, that's ruining the UK's reputation, with all the stupid bickering that's going on in Parliament, then it will impact the value of the pound. Now,
but uncertainty, in the simplest terms, will impact the value of the pound, and a no-deal Brexit becomes formal uncertainty as opposed to the informal uncertainty that we have now.
Well, absolutely, but I would suggest, and I would say this allegedly, I would suggest that the wealthy set are moving their money overseas because they realise that when things hit rock bottom, they can bring their money back in and double it.
Yes, and so that means that people who've got money will be buying up assets at knockdown prices, which is kind of what disaster capitalism means, isn't it? And because sometimes...
Surely...
Go on.
Sorry, surely that's a version of insider trading, though. If you're in charge of a government and you're basically noveling the country, aren't you doing it to benefit yourself?
Well, as long as you don't get photographed with a really cheesy grin on your face, pointing at a graph showing the pound tanking as a result of your political campaigning, you should be fine, shouldn't you?
Yeah, but if you're actually operating to get the actual... The system to crash so you can benefit from it, then surely it is highly illegal, and you shouldn't be in the position to actually do
guarantee that it would work. So I suppose the argument would be, well, we backed it, but we backed that horse, and we cheered that horse, and we did everything we could to support that horse, and we gave that horse the finest oats that money can buy, but we couldn't guarantee the horse would win, so you can't call us the architects of our own.
Yeah, but if you go to the work of Dick Francis and some of the books he came out with in the 70s about the horse racing trade, surely you know that they can rig the races to whatever they want it to happen.
Well, yes, but the referendum result depended upon people exercising votes. You're right; they were misled, they were manipulated. The Vote Leave campaign cheated and lied and continues to do so, but it's the punters who cast the votes that pushed them over the line. So you have, I mean, emotionally and intuitively, I agree with everything you said, but legally I think it would be very hard to make a case. All I would say in defence of Jamie's position is that it is very hard to see men who have dedicated their entire lives to getting richer than anybody needs to be. I'm not one of those supporters of a redistribution of wealth that is troubled by wealth. I personally think, I appreciate this upsets the Jeremy Corbyn contingency, I think things grind to a shuddering halt if there isn't glittering prizes at the top of the economic tree. The concern for me is how far away the top of the economic tree is from the bottom of the economic tree. So you need people who are motivated by money and who are entrepreneurial, but you also need people who aren't, to put checks and balances in place. You look at some of the backers of Brexit, the ones with the private jets, the ones with the household name posh hotels, the ones with the newspapers, the ones with their own Channel Island, the ones with funds that are heavily invested in emerging markets or developing countries, or third world as we used to call them. You look at those people and you wonder, why on earth are they backing Brexit? And then you say, have they done anything in their lives to this point that wasn't motivated by the thought of making money, by the thought of making a killing, by the thought of seeing their already enormous fortunes grow even more? Because that's the only thing they care about. And if you look at those men, and they're almost all men, and find yourself wondering whether they've ever done anything in their lives that wasn't designed to make themselves richer, and you find yourself concluding that they haven't, then you come pretty close to Jamie's worldview, and, for the record, mine. No takers so far for my turkey conundrum. Sounds like a really bad Robert Ludlum novel, doesn't it? The Turkey Conundrum. Here is my turkey conundrum as we survey the mess last night. And unfortunately, the mess was everywhere last night. The Conservative Party obviously bear the brunt of criticism because they split more completely than the Labour Party, but there were enough Labour MPs defying their own whip to ensure that the Labour's favoured amendment didn't pass, and the TIG, of course, the independent group, should probably have got behind Nick Bowles's amendment in order to minimise the dangers of a really, really bad, hard Brexit and going instead for a preferable soft Brexit, but they remain probably too committed to the hope of calling the whole thing off to throw their weight behind any Brexit. So it continues. But the Turkey question fascinates me. And this is something I'd like you either to explain to me why I've got it wrong, or how you can sustain the position I'm about to describe. You remember in the run-up to the referendum, the exaggerated, hugely embellished and rather racist threat of Turkey joining the European Union was used as a reason why we had to leave. You remember that? It was official, it was endorsed, it was on posters. Turkey is set to join the European Union, and it was the sugar-free version, the fat-free version of that disgusting Breaking Point poster that didn't even feature Turkish people on it. It featured refugees from the Middle East crossing the Balkans in a long queue, but it was obviously designed to scare people in exactly the same way that Joseph Goebbels used very similar imagery to scare people as the Nazis rose to power in 1930s Germany. So you look at that Turkey question, and then you look at the same people that were behind the scaremongering about Turkey, saying they couldn't vote for Ken Clarke's customs union last night because it wouldn't be leaving properly. And then I remind you, as nobody, as far as I'm aware, Krishna Gurumurthy pointed this out, the Channel 4 news presenter, who's one of the very, very few members of my profession to cover himself in glory during this sorry mess. Turkey is in the customs union. So Turkey simultaneously is not in the European Union, but might be one day, therefore we should leave, but is in the customs union, which, were we to emulate that, we wouldn't be leaving properly. Can anyone... I don't think anyone can explain that to me. I hope somebody from the ERG is asked about it live on television. Maybe Steve Baker. In fact, let's ask Steve Baker now. Steve, what do you think about the Turkey conundrum?
Well, everybody knows I'm Brexit hardman Steve Baker, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, good answer. Gary's in Letchworth. Gary, what's going on?
Oh, hi, James.
Are you Brexit hardman, Gary, in Letchworth?
Oh, that sounds got a nice ring to it, hasn't it? Yeah, I'm sure Steve Baker does it better than me, though. I'm sure.
We all know our place.
Oh, God, yeah, we all know our place, don't we? So I find myself in a bit of a Brexit quagmire, really, because I work for a UK distribution company, and we sell medical devices.
Right.
But our suppliers are all European companies, one in France, one in Germany, one in Spain. And what my concern is, we have a UK warehouse where we buy products from the suppliers and store them, but should we have a request for a medical device that's a bit out of the ordinary, say a size that we don't keep in a warehouse, we would order that directly from our supplier in Europe. So in the event of a no-deal Brexit, how does that work? How does that affect people's operations? How does it affect the treatment of patients? And we simply don't know the answer to that yet.
Well, you say yet. It's April the 12th that this happened.
Exactly, James. I mean, I'm literally pulling my hair out because the fact... the place where we have arrived in British political discourse is quite frankly disgusting. We certainly mudder the people who are willing to give up their own seats to do what's right for the country, and hold up the liars as bastions of democracy and sovereignty. And the same people that do that are now crying at the results of what's happened in our democratically elected sovereign parliament. I mean, quite frankly, mind-boggling. But in terms of my own personal journey and where I will be in the future, I really just do not know, and it is terrifying, James. I'm the sole supplier, sole breadwinner, in my family.
Yes.
My wife had a bleed on her brain 5 years ago, giving birth to our daughter, so she can't work. I've got a 5-year-old daughter in school, and you know what happens to us if I lose my job because we can't get the supplies in.
I think you speak for an awful lot of people who hopefully will be fine. But you want to know hope. You can't pay the mortgage with hope. You can't pay the bills with hope, can you? You can't feed the kids with hope. Hopefully you will be fine. I even now have this sense that somehow we can't be doing something as potentially catastrophic as the most senior civil servant in the country suggests we might be. But even if we pull through, you've been through this for no reason whatsoever. And I think it's going to be very hard to return to what I suppose we have to call normality when these people, these politicians, these parliamentarians, 2 of whom are now 5-1 at Ladbrokes to be the next Prime Minister, they have done this to you and to everybody else for reasons that they still can't explain. And most of the reasons they gave in the run-up to encouraging people to do it have fallen apart like lemon meringue.
Yeah, and they continue to fall apart. And
every day, mate. Every day.
They just, I don't know if they fully appreciate the psychological stress and worry that it puts on someone like me. I mean, I'm a bit of an insomniac anyway.
No, I know exactly what you mean. That 3 o'clock call, you wake up, you're all right for 10 seconds, then you start thinking about the stuff that you shouldn't be thinking about, the adrenaline kicks in and you know you're there for another hour, at least.
Exactly, mate. Exactly.
And you're not worrying, you're worrying about your children, you're worrying about your wife, you're worrying about your future, and you're worrying about You're just survival. All you want is a little guarantee that you can carry on more or less as you are. Maybe a ship will come in and you'll get a big result. Maybe you'll have a bad few months, but you just need to know where the middle ground is and how you stay on it.
Yep. You know, my only silver lining in all of this, mate, is that my wife is Polish.
Yes.
My daughter has dual citizenship, so a Polish and English passport, or British passport, sorry.
Yes.
And my grandfather was Irish, so I'm applying for my Irish passport. And so the only silver lining I can see from this is that if things got really bad, I could move to another European country.
It's not a silver lining, forgive me for being so pedantic, because you could have done that even if we hadn't left. So what you're saying is it's an escape route. It's the only thing that sort of dilutes some of the despair is the thought that at least my family has the option to get out of here. You could have done all of those things even if we hadn't left. You wanted to move to Poland or to Ireland, you could have done that, and it would have been easier, in fact. But I know what you mean when you use the figure of speech. I'm sorry for splitting hairs.
No, you're right, though. Or the other side is that listening to the House of Commons debate last night, it seemed quite evident to me that if we leave with a no-deal Brexit, that is the end of the UK as we know it. Scotland will vote for independence.
It has to. I don't want it to. I don't want it to because I feel at home when I'm in Scotland. I like the Union. I know that sounds a little bit paternalistic from London, but you're right. How could it possibly survive? How could it possibly survive?
Well, it won't, and the only other option that I have then is that perhaps the Scots will be as kind as to offer a hand of graciousness to an Englishman like myself and give me a home in Scotland as part of
I'll be queuing up, mate.
The European Union.
I'll be queuing up in Berwick-on-Tweed, seriously. I'll be seeking asylum. Oh, Gary, at least you've still got your sense of humour, but I mean it. I'm all right at the moment. My big insomnia period came not long after I lost my dad for some reason. I think it just brings everything into focus. And I've been through all of the ramifications and extrapolations of Brexit and my own financial situation, and I think I'm okay. There might be something I'm missing coming down the line. I suppose, LBC could go belly up, although that's unlikely. I know exactly what those 3 o'clock in the morning hours of despair are like, and it's so weird because you wake up the next morning and you wonder what you were worrying about. You've just got to get up and get on with it, but something happens in the small hours when you think about the worst. You think about the wheels falling off. And politicians are supposed to protect us from that kind of uncertainty. However you vote, nobody ever votes to be less certain, to be less clear about things. Some people, odd though it sounds, do vote to be less well off. If you vote for the Labour Party in recent years, despite being a high or top rate taxpayer, you are voting to pay more tax than you currently do. So even that isn't true. The idea that nobody ever votes to be less well off. Some people do, because what you lose in material capital, you gain in social capital. Housing, hospitals, schools, roads, health, all of those things. It's easy to see the trade-off unless you're incredibly selfish. These politicians, these hard men, are making our lives worse. What a difference a year makes, honestly. It is currently April 2019, and the Daily Mail has an enormous headline today saying top Mandarin's bombshell no-deal warning to Cabinet. If the last fella was still in the editor's chair, I suspect that this chap would have a column.
Well, everybody knows I'm Brexit hardman Steve Baker, as far as I'm aware.
It's 3 minutes after 11. You're listening to Brexit hardman James O'Brien live on LBC as we continue to look for the positives of this so-called crashing out with no deal, that significant swathes of the population have been persuaded is somehow desirable. WTO terms, yay! Well, hang on, what's that sovereignty that you kept banging on about? How is that served by WTO terms, by falling into a safety net designed to protect countries who, by dint of outside circumstances, are facing economic oblivion? Now, that's what it's there for, the World Trade Organization. The free trade agreements that countries and markets put in place above that safety net are the ways towards prosperity and, if you must use such a nuanced word, freedom. But the idea that the base level, the safety net itself, is preferable to anything else available is bonkers. Absolutely bonkers, to quote that political sage Dizzy Rascal. Brian's in Harrow. Brian, what would you like to say?
You'll have to bear with me, James. I've got a cold today, so
of course
excuse me if I don't come across too clearly.
You're sounding crystal clear to me, Brian.
I'm disabled. I had a spinal cord injury some years ago. I'm paralysed from the shoulders down. Some limited use of my arms, and I have live-in carers. So I have carers with me 24/7 because I don't have use of my arms, and I'm completely paralysed. Below that level, and one of my carers is English, but the other one is European. And if there's no deal Brexit, I simply don't know if my European carer will be allowed back in the country to come and work with me. And we're assuming that he will, but there's no guarantee that he'll be able, that the settled status scheme will even exist in the context of a no-deal Brexit. And on that basis, he may not be able to get back in the country. And so when my English carer goes off for his 2 weeks break, I may not have anyone to step into his shoes. And whenever I have been in this position in the past with carers being ill or anything else, there's a number of agencies that I use with the specialist skill set required to provide care for somebody with a spinal cord injury. And I've spoken to all of the ones that I usually work with, and they're in exactly the same position as me, because as you know, Europeans have been propping up the health and social care sector for years now, and they simply don't know if their staff will be allowed back in the country. We're all working on the assumption that the hopeful assumption that they will.
And also the sort of, lazy isn't the right word, but the effortless presumption of humanity would suggest that they'd do something, that the plight you described could not be countenanced, it couldn't be allowed. But the point you're making so brilliantly, and you've second-guessed a couple of the questions that I was preparing, you've already answered. The point you're making so brilliantly is that nobody can tell you what you want to hear at the moment. Nobody can tell you what you need to hear at the moment.
absolutely no certainty. So, I mean, I've had discussions with both my carers, and my English carer has said that if that is the case, that he will, step up to the mark and won't leave. But there's a limit to...
It can't be indefinite,
because of the intensity of the work.
I understand. It's the specific skills that are needed to care for you that could be...
It's not something that I can easily pick up from...
No, and equally, I can't come round and look after you in the way that you need to be looked after, because I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't have the...
No, and there's a limit to how long one person can do it, because it's a 24-hour job, and I call on them day and night. And if I don't have access to that assistance, then my condition very quickly becomes life-threatening. And I was saying to your researcher, asked me what happens. Well, put bluntly, I either check myself into the nearest hospital, which again may not have the skills to provide me with the care, because I've been in hospital settings before when I've been ill, where my carers have had to come in to provide some of the specialist care provision that general hospitals, the staff just aren't qualified to provide. Or I check myself into the nearest morgue, and if I'm left without care for more than 48 hours, then that's the situation. I don't have any family in this country. I've got friends, I'm sure they'd step in, yes. But it's quite a stark place to be in.
And forgive me for saying this, you described the worst case scenario, and I know Gary in Letchworth and I now feel a little bit ridiculous for comparing notes on our insomnia, and the stuff that keeps us awake at night suddenly pales into utter insignificance compared to the stuff that keeps you awake at night. And the reason I say it's the worst case scenario is because we have to we have to believe that it won't come to this. But
equally, so do I. I don't really have much option but to...
And all you want is clarity.
To continue planning. I just want clarity.
I suppose it's scant comfort to you that as a result of this path that the country has taken, there'll be fewer people speaking foreign on trains this time next year, Brian?
I think you know the answer to that question. As you can probably tell, I'm not from a local of Middlesex, so for me to... I've lived here 25 years, but for me to complain about immigrants would be churlish at best, and disingenuous at the very best. But
it's for everybody. We realise
I welcome the having lived with carers from all parts of Europe and indeed all parts of the world for the last 25 years. I not only have they kept me alive, but they have enriched my life with the cultural diversification and education that they've given me. So it's not just a case that they keep me alive. I far from wanting to avoid people speaking foreign on trains, I find that fascinating because I've had a window,
of course,
into dealing with them on a very intimate one-to-one basis and establishing their humanity and my humanity and recognizing how common that is and how fortunate I have been to have been exposed to all these wonderful people that are prepared to put their lives on hold for 2 weeks at a time to facilitate keeping me alive. And the prospect of labeling them as anything other than, to be frank, heroes is I just find it quite staggering. I think that's only for people who have no experience of what goes on in the health and social care sector.
Or no concern for what goes on in the health and care sector. You're more generous than I am. I think there are two categories of people. You offer them ignorance. I offer them callous complicity. Some of them.
I work in health and social care policy as well, so I'm coming from a unique position of knowledge that I'm speaking to officials in NHS England and the Department of Health.
Gosh.
And asking them these questions, and they can't provide me with the answers.
What I'm about to say, I was preparing to say to you before you revealed your own professional involvement in these matters, so it's probably even more redundant and ridiculous than it already was. But if at any point, whatever happens in the coming months, anything to your benefit that involves just being amplified and having a platform like this, I want you to take Beth's number when we finish this call, and it sounds pathetic, Brian, but if there's anything we can do to help you, if things do deteriorate, then we'll do it, I promise you. Just in the sense of being a loud hailer, I appreciate how pathetic that sounds, but it's all I've got.
Well, I think don't underestimate the value of getting the message out there that
I hope so.
There are very real life consequences of the uncertainty, and even if we come out the other end and everything is okay, what you've been put through and what others have been put through on a lower level of stress and worry, but all of us, our worlds expand or contract, don't they, to the perimeters and the parameters of our own existence. It doesn't matter saying, I would never say to anybody, well, at least you're not paralysed from the neck down like Brian is, because all our problems feel urgent and pertinent to us. Yes,
but it's the fretting and the worrying that we're being put through. People are being put through.
The uncertainty and the... it has an effect on my mental health, which is...
I'm sure it does.
Which exists in tandem with my physical health. So, it's not small beer.
It's not small beer. What a gentleman you are. Thank you. And I mean it for what it's worth.
Thank you for taking my call.
Right, any time you want, my friend, any time you want. And if there is anything to be gained from drawing attention to anything to which you want attention to be drawn, we are in your service. I swear it to you. I can't do any funny little throwaway lines or clips of those people. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that half-wits with anonymous social media accounts preaching callousness are representative of everybody, or indeed anybody, who voted to leave the European Union. Nobody decent listens to Brian's story without feeling enormous amounts of sympathy. Don't let them, whoever they are, turn it into a football that we kick around opposing teams. I believe that a no-deal Brexit is the stupidest voluntary act that any country in living memory has ever taken, if we actually go down that path. When I listen to the people who advocate it, I feel my fears firming up, because they are, to a man, utter idiots. They are beyond rational analysis now. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a psychological condition wherein people lack the intelligence to understand how unintelligent they are. So if you're wondering how somebody could stand in front of television cameras at a time of self-imposed national crisis and contribute this to public discourse.
Well, everybody knows I'm Brexit hardman Steve Baker, as far as I'm aware.
You need to understand what Dunning-Kruger is. Dunning-Kruger is a lack of the most fundamental awareness of how little you know. It's a thing of beauty in theoretical and academic terms, because it explains so much. I think it was Aristotle who said that the wise man is the man who appreciates how little he knows. The wise man knows how little he knows. The opposite of the wise man, the dumb man, thinks he knows lots and isn't actually wise enough to realise how little he knows. Which is how, I think, and this is all I've got at the moment, it's how these ludicrous slogans can be inflated and sent around the world. These utterly meaningless, fatuous phrases that they still utter. And I don't know how many of the people who echo those utterances, I never will know, nor will you, how many people who march around London with a WTO Now placard, which doesn't mean anything and is, under any available analysis, disastrous for our country. I don't know how many of them suffer from Dunning-Kruger effect and how many of them suffer from my own description of a psychological condition, which is simply deference. This weird belief people have that they're not as good as those blokes on the telly. They're not as good as that clown in a top hat. They're not as good as that bloke what went to Eton. They're somehow able to put their trust in utter trumpets because of the English class system. I say English because I think it's less commonplace in Scotland and Wales, actually. Northern Ireland, I think, is too nuanced and multi-textured to lend itself to this simplistic sort of analysis, but it's a very English thing. The doffing of the cap, the tugging of the forelock, even at people whose own lack of understanding is so complete, so utterly complete, that they can come out with lines like that at times like this. But I, like you, won't forget Brian's call in a hurry. How's it going to affect you? Because it's days away. April the 12th, unless things change. Last night could have offered up some form of compromise, but one man's compromise is another man's betrayal. Nick Bowles, I thought, was very poignant and powerful. Oddly, everyone else in the office laughed when we played this clip earlier, and I didn't laugh. I laugh a lot at what goes on in Parliament, but I thought there was something quite plaintive about whoever it was on the Tory benches saying, "Oh, Nick, please don't go." Can we dig that clip out as well, just to illustrate what I'm describing? "Oh, Nick, please don't go," because it reminded us of the humanity of politicians. I know I've just embarked upon a epic castigation of some of them, simply put, the ones that are too stupid to realise how stupid they are. But most of them we need to remember, they're human beings as well. They're colleagues. You can be friends with someone on the other side of the House of Commons. This ideological purity that is gathering pace on both sides of the divide is absurd. So you no doubt have Jeremy Corbyn hardliners saying, "Don't feel sorry for Nick Bowles," and you know, it is fair to point out that his voting record on some issues is ugly. You know, for my money, on tax cuts for the rich or on any of the austerity policies that the Tories and the Liberal Democrats waved through, it is ugly. But it's not a permanent reason to discredit somebody. The way you voted in 2016 does not define the moral worth of how you voted last night on a completely different issue. This is the stuff of the gulags, this sort of ideological purity. "Oh, well, no, Anna Soubry voted for austerity, so I don't care whether she voted in the way that I approve of or not last night." Well, then you're stupid too. So much stupid. That's where we are. This is the clip I'm referring to.
"I regret, therefore, to announce that I can no longer sit for this party."
Nick, don't go. Come on.
Nick, don't go, come on. That I know it's a curious thing to pick up on and not find hilarious. And it'll probably turn out to be somebody that I don't hold in very high regard that said it. But it just struck me as a reminder that these are husbands and sons and cousins and fathers and that these are men and women with jobs, some of whom went into Parliament to do the right thing, some of whom went into Parliament because their egos are utterly without check. I just thought I'd mention it. 11:24 is the time. You've probably fallen asleep. Ian is in Berlin. Ian, what would you like to say?
Well, I was primed to talk about my own situation, but after your last caller, I didn't really feel...
No, but we all feel a little bit trivial in comparison.
Exactly.
Brian wouldn't want us to stop discussing different scenarios simply out of respect and sympathy for his. I think I can say that on his behalf.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it'll have a minor effect on me. It's having a minor effect. It will hurt my earning capacity. It will give me a headache in relation to sort of immigration status. I'm half Italian. I can get Italian. I'm getting an Italian passport, all of which is a headache just to stand still and do what I was doing 3 years ago.
And that becomes astonishingly, that phrase "so much stupid" is going to be echoing through my head for the rest of the show today, because astonishingly, if you are able to stand still, they will turn around and point at you and go, "Ha-ha, you see, the world hasn't come to an end. Ian, despite a few setbacks, is more or less where he was before Brexit. The people who told us we would have our cake and eat it, we would inhabit sunlit uplands, we'd have unicorns by Christmas, will use you being able to stand still, if indeed you can, as evidence that they weren't wrong." That's the next horrible chapter, isn't it, potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I was sort of listening to your final comments about, the doffing your cap type mentality of the English reminded me of George Orwell's essay, England, Your England, which is a brilliant analysis of what the English are. And he didn't write England, my England, of course. He wrote England, Your England. And he wrote it during the Second World War, and it's a sort of fantastic analysis. And what he says is that there is this doffing the cap mentality in England, which gives us an unholy alliance between the toffs, the top hats, and then the working class, who are allied together against all forms of intellectual reason. And anyone who is a so-called intellectual is basically a traitor. And that was his analysis.
He goes a little further into the. He does accuse left-wing intellectuals. I don't know whether it's in England, Your England, or not, of lacking some form of, for want of a better word, patriotism. Some sort of positive love of country. He accuses that generalised grouping of that. But yeah, you're right. It is that horseshoe, isn't it, of the people who you and I sense will never understand. How can you be comfortable with the idea of Jacob Rees-Mogg getting richer while you get poorer? Answer, I don't know. What is the answer to that?
It's weird. Well, the answer is to keep shining the light. I mean, my fear is that people like you, you're a searchlight, you're a brilliant searchlight into all this sort of mentality and all the rest of it. But you and I are sort of a minority, or at least you're a minority in the media. The Guardian does its best and so on, but the sort of mainstream media... The
Times has done very well. I know the Times has to occasionally jump to Rupert Murdoch's calling, but the finest compliment I think I've ever been paid in my career in The Guardian yesterday said he's a bit like Matthew Paris. Matthew Paris, for me, I'll take a bit. Matthew Paris, for me, has been an absolute beacon. So there are plenty of people doing it, but not organs.
People trying it, but it's just... Yeah, I mean, the problem you've got is the mathematics. You've got a Prime Minister who is, as Mandelson said yesterday, has been the Prime Minister and is being the Prime Minister of the Conservative Party and needs to start being Prime Minister of the country because, you're a country of all kinds of different people, not just the Tory Party faithful. Well, that's all she's been pursuing. But the problem you're going to get is if Brexit goes through, your last caller, or the one before that, I think, was mentioning that Scotland will drift off, which is a high likelihood.
Well, don't take his word for it. Here is the Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sedwill, saying our national security would be disrupted, the stability of union would be dislocated.
And then you're left with a rump of sort of conservative England, which will be sort of managing its own little kind of even smaller, nation. With its influence in the world getting, even more diminished, but it will remain that sort of English rump, and they'll kid themselves that this is the best outcome. I mean, people will then say, "Well, it was, what a great result this is. We can now just be English." But and they'll be following this sort of ideology, the mixture of sort of the weird ideologies of the sort of the Brexit purists, together with the top hats who just want to make money.
It's the strangest thing, isn't it? And
with the doffing of the caps.
Yeah, with Orwell, you sort of pull the rug from under my feet a bit because he understood it all, didn't he? I wonder whether if he was here now, he'd be the least surprised commentator by the chaos that's been caused.
But that's why it's so sad that you've had this debate. I mean, literally, you could read England, Your England, and think of it.
I think we all will after this.
It could have been written last week, and it's sad that we haven't moved on. Actually, it's really sad that as a nation we've not managed to move on, and that is the root of the problem with Brexit. And I think that the Economist said this just before Christmas. Brexit isn't just a mistake; it's a reckoning.
Yes.
It's because we have allowed ourselves to continue with this sort of national identity problem. It's because we've got a ruling class that's badly educated, because they're educated in elite ways which are not really suitable for modern life. And it's because we've got a ruling class that's disdainful of the ordinary people.
I'm going to read a Robert Tressel quote when I come back from the news. I just need to...
It's because of all those things, it's a reckoning, and so we're finally seeing what it is. But, sadly, unless things can really pull round, we're just in 70 years' time, someone will be saying, well, how quaint was that, James O'Brien saying all those things,
Yes.
And we won't have learned the lessons.
No, they won't be allowed to mention me by name. I'll be like,
you'll be
Trotsky in Stalinist Russia, mate.
You'll be run out of England.
One thing I'd mention, oddly, is that, of course, Orwell's ability to call it so correctly was born in part of the fact that he went to Eton as a scholarship boy. He saw it from the inside, you see, and if you're on the inside, you get a much clearer picture of what you've just described than some people on the outside ever do. That's the... I think that's why they reserve their most furious anger for the ones who have benefited from the system and then turn around and say, that's really not fair. That's really not right. Ian, yeah. I'd like you. I hope things are as close to the status quo as is possible. Nobody, I don't imagine, is going to be waiting on the next line to claim that your life is going to in any way improve. But they might be speaking a bit less foreign on trains. Just reflecting on Orwell, recommended by the last caller, Ian in Berlin. Of course, Orwell is often cited. It's one of the great flaws of social media. People can find a quote from Orwell to support. It's a bit like the Bible, actually, or the Quran. You can find a quote to support pretty much any position that you're seeking to promote. Selective quoting from exhaustive texts is not the way to enlightenment. But Orwell was when you are developing politically, I don't know who your guiding lights were, but when you're developing politically, there's a unique comfort to be found in reading the words of people who are much cleverer than you, but who have arrived at similar conclusions about the world around them. It's incredibly reassuring when you're developing politically, especially if, like me, you grew up during a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity in this country. I know that there is work to be done. I'm not suggesting that a country where food banks are commonplace and where sanctions are state-supported. I'm thinking prior to the last financial collapse, between the end of the Second World War and the last financial collapse. So there's at least 2-3 recessions in there anyway. So I'm not suggesting things were even close to perfect. I'm just suggesting that prior to that period, things were even worse. So probably because my political development took place in a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, I felt that my guiding lights, my heroes, as I read a lot as a kid, were company and comfort. They don't feel like comfort anymore because all of the stuff that informed their political conclusions is happening again. I don't know if you've ever read The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists by Robert Tressel. It's an astonishing book. The story behind the book is even arguably as moving as the book itself. It was published posthumously by his daughter. He worked, I think, as a painter and decorator. It's set among painter and decorators, this book. And it's a cri de coeur, really, for the cessation of a society where this happens. I said I'd read you a quote from it. My thanks to whoever tweeted it to me. It's 30 years since I read this book, you know. The majority work hard and live in poverty. Remember, I read this at public school. I always think of Orwell. I didn't go to Eton, but imagine if Rees-Mogg had been in the next room. I don't know what he would have been reading. The majority work hard and live in poverty in order that the minority may live in luxury without working at all. And as the majority are mostly fools, they not only agree to pass their lives in incessant slavery and want in order to pay this rent to those who own the country, but they say it is quite right that they should have to do so and are very grateful to the little minority for allowing them to remain in the country at all. And that, I'm afraid, is your cap-doffing, forelock-tugging, Brexit-supporting minority. Right there. Not everyone who voted Brexit is stupid. Not everybody who voted Brexit is grateful to the little minority for allowing them to remain in the country at all. Not everybody who voted Brexit is living in relative poverty in order that the minority may live in luxury without working at all. And not everyone who voted Brexit is deserving of the description fools. That's why Tressel writes, mostly fools. And nothing's changed at all. It's a lovely little article about a children's charity that has found pictures, must be some of the earliest photographs, from I think 1869. Can that be right? Did we have photographs that long ago? Anyway, I've only read the text. I haven't seen the pictures. They've identified, it might just be names and birth certificates. Yeah, it must be, mustn't it? But people who were essentially rescued by this charity in 1869. And it reminds us that when we were born, certainly if you were born in before me, if you were born in the 50s, that was arguably living memory, you know, that there were levels of poverty almost unbelievable. Dickens is in the rearview mirror. I thought Dickens was ancient history when I was growing up. Dickens is in the rearview mirror. Robert Tressel, 20th century. Orwell published his best works in the 40s. This is not the distant past. This is yesterday. And if it was yesterday, it could be tomorrow. And if you recognise a world where the majority work hard and live in poverty in order that the minority may live in luxury without working at all, then it could be your tomorrow. Sorry about that. Not the most cheering contemplation that I've ever inflicted upon you. Luckily, Ian Dunt is here to provide some light relief. I didn't know that Ian was going to be in the building today, and I saw him passing in the distance and summoned him into the studio to talk us through his favourite computer game. No, you are one of the people I turn to. People turn to me in times of stress, Ian Dunt. I turn to Ian Dunt in times of stress. What's going on?
Bad things. So I think I'm probably a bit more depressed about Brexit this morning than I have been really at any stage in this process. Yeah. Because yesterday it felt like the people who I normally feel quite a lot of sympathy with, Remainers, soft Brexiters, had started to behave with the same kind of ideological frenzy that we see the ERG behaving with, the hardliners.
And doing that Judean People's Front of Judea thing, where Exactly. They are essentially on the same side, but they can't agree on the way forward.
Well, look, at the heart of this is it just comes down to there is no contradiction between simultaneously pursuing your ideal outcome and your least bad outcome. Yeah. And in any scenario, like if you're going to have an argument with your husband or wife, you should probably start doing the same thing at the same time. Like, that is just basic tactics. Don't just think, what do I really want? Also think, what can I live with in this scenario? They're not doing that. And to see like the Independent Group or the Tiggers or Change You Go, whatever it is that they're calling themselves, who I'm obviously, instinctively very sympathetic towards. Yes. I especially like the idea of people working with people from different parties, and that looks like an important thing to do right now. So it's crazily depressing to watch them yesterday refuse to back options which would at least lower the damage of Brexit, even if the worst comes to the worst and it takes place. So
because they could have done both. I think the word "and" is the most crucial in your analysis, isn't it? It was they voted for their favourite and for nothing else. So in the case of the Tiggers, they went for the confirmatory referendum, but they didn't go for Bowles.
Exactly. Well, you think you're not only being given one option here, you're allowed to cross as many boxes as you want. This whole process was set up to help you think pragmatically, to try and get you to move away from your ideal outcome. They completely failed to live up to that moment. Nick Bowles, who, he is not ideal. Like, when he first put out his plans for single market stuff, it was just covered in really rudimentary errors.
Sure.
But to his credit, it was basically a first draft, and he listened to people, he cleaned it up a bit.
It's a beautiful example of someone who's not suffering from the Dunning-Kruger effect, because he got stuff wrong and he made mistakes, and he learned from them. He didn't. I don't know if you've heard this yet today, but if you need a distillation of the Dunning-Kruger effect in the context of Brexit, here's Steve Baker to provide you with one. No. There isn't Steve Baker to provide you with one. I shall treat you to that in a moment.
I'm weirdly relieved.
But I like what you say about Bowles, because you get this momentum line as well today, which is, he voted for this and he voted for that. Therefore, everything he ever does for the rest of his life is worthless, and he deserves credit for learning from the mistakes that he made.
It's like that thing where increasingly in politics on the right and the left, they want you to just barrier down your empathy, basically. To think, unless you agree with every single position that someone has taken throughout their life, then you're not allowed to agree with them on anything. You get this with Tony Blair all the time. I marched against the Iraq War. The Iraq War was obviously a catastrophically stupid thing to do and pursued in a terrible manner. But because I disagree with him about a policy that took place 10 years ago, doesn't mean that I have to consider him complete persona non grata for the rest of our lives.
Yes.
You have to be able to look at people and think, we disagree on this, we agree on this, we can work together on that, we can't on that.
Politics being the art of the possible. That's what we've all forgotten.
Indeed. Well, that might even be what a civilised society entails, you know, if you want to be really radical about things. I mean, Nick Boles yesterday, he started the day not being prepared to vote for the people's vote. He said he was going to abstain on it, which is basically his way of trying to give some ground. When it came down to it, he did vote for it. He did vote for a second referendum. You know what was nice about that? Was it showed someone that was intellectually alive in the moment.
When the facts change?
Yes, exactly. Being able to move around, being able to be flexible with their thoughts, trying to be pragmatic, trying to work together. So that makes it doubly depressing, right? When then immediately afterwards he has to stand up on those benches and go, I can't do this anymore. I just can't do this. And
it was poignant, that, wasn't it? Because it reflected a reality that many of his colleagues on those very benches continue to deny I think even for you, and if anyone's followed things even more closely than I have, it would be you.
We both look quite traumatised.
We are looking about 506 years old. That's something out of Sauron. Seriously, we look like characters in a Tolkien novel. But hey, that's just the facial hair. The point being that it's refreshing, for want of a better word, to be reminded of what politics should look like. It should look rational, and it should look evidence-based, and it should move, and it should, be not on rails, but on wheels, and it isn't. And Bowles reminds us of what it went, and Grieve as well, of course, and look what's happened to him.
Even Grieve wasn't really shifting yesterday
you're right,
on that stuff. I mean, he wasn't willing to throw his weight behind single market and customs union stuff.
No, you're right.
And so that makes it doubly, you see Bowles do it, and then he not only he has to leave the Tory party at that moment. So what you were seeing is, because he's deeply involved in the modernisation project for the Tory party and the Cameron and all of that, so that's the president there, you think that's the end of an era right there. But secondly, you sort of it felt like it was the end of pragmatism in the Tory party, something really deep-seated. So as he walked away from the Tory benches, and there's a voice next to him who was just saying, like, please stop, like, just stop, come back,
no,
come
I
back.
think it was Hugh Merriman. I launched a bid today to find out who it was, and Hugh Merriman is leading the voting at the moment. Another good egg, albeit that if you were a Jeremy Corbyn supporter, the idea of suggesting that a Conservative politician is deserving of anything other than lynching would see you shipped off to the gulag by tea time.
Yeah, because your political enemies are supposed to be the exact limit of your capacity for empathy. Yeah. And so, one can't think anything good about one's opponents, which is pretty much the worst possible way one could ever look at politics.
I'm not going to ask what you think is going to happen, because your guess is as good as anybody's, but what are the options now, do you think?
I think at the moment we're in the world of really harsh choices, which is the no deal versus revoke decision, which will be happening sort of next week. Or we're in the world of lesser choices, which would be May's deal passing on a fourth attempt, or a longer extension to the end of the year or to March next year. Now, at the moment, I'm not much of a betting man. I wouldn't want to put money on it because I think it's tight, but I would probably go with the latter, with either May's deal or a longer extension being more likely than the more brutal, violent choices of no deal versus revoke. But only just.
Albeit that the more brutal, violent choice would at least deliver certainty of sorts in a way that the other two options would not. They would be postponements, wouldn't they, in some sense?
Yeah. Still? I mean, so the way that Brussels has always talked about this on the no deal is we will have, like, a few weeks of no deal, maybe a couple of months at most, and then Britain will go back to that negotiating table with its tail between its legs in complete havoc, and they will put down the withdrawal agreement that they are offering us now. The backstop, the divorce payment, all of that will just happen, but with 2 months deferred, with us in a much, much worse negotiating position, going through total economic and political calamity.
So we can't hang up our pens or our microphones just yet, can we?
I can't believe you still use pens. So old-fashioned.
No, everyone laughs at me for that. You should see what I do. I use scissors to cut stories out of the newspaper. Look at you laughing at me. I'm only 47. Ian Dunt is the editor of politics.co.uk, the author of Brexit, What the Hell Happens Now, and also one of the hosts on the splendid Remainiacs cast podcast. A lot of your fans on Twitter would like to pass on their appreciation and shock that you managed to conduct this entire interview without swearing. It's 11:49. Even, those of us who do this for a living can lose sight of the ball at times, and sometimes on social media you get bombarded with things that you either don't understand or you don't take the time properly to understand. At its worst, this is complete lies being spread around Facebook, for example, by bad actors. Bad actors is such a funny phrase. I always think of El Dorado. That's alienated a significant swathe of my audience under the age of 40, I think. Keith remembers El Dorado. Marcus. Bad actors. It was a soap opera that had arguably some bad acting in it. But bad actors, of course, is also a phrase to mean people who wish us harm, people who wish us ill. So why would anybody put together a professional-looking account of a completely bogus Lisbon Treaty and then see it broadcast and spread and shared on Facebook to such a degree that even people ended up ringing this programme. And yes, I am setting myself apart from the pack when I say this programme, to suggest that it might be true. All you had to do was a 3 or 4 word Google to find out whether it was true or not. And then you would find out it was all hogwash, but it's still on your Auntie Doris's Facebook page. Your dad's still banging on about it over Sunday lunch, and yet it's completely untrue. So when the dust has really settled, please, if it does, and we find ourselves asking, where did that come from? These questions need answering. On the other side, I sometimes see stuff on social media, and I think it can't be that bad. Stuff from the rational, evidence-based Remain side of the argument. And I think, well, no, it can't be that bad. And people have been picking over the changes to immigration rules that were published by the government on March the 7th. And they appear to have found some profoundly troubling phenomena. The human rights... Well, I mean, what I find most interesting about this is that if it's being understood correctly, then Northern Ireland-born Irish citizens could be seeing the rights that they were afforded by treaty in the Belfast Agreement, in the Good Friday Agreement, eroded or removed completely. Emma de Souza is the citizens' rights campaigner who has done more to bring this into the light than any other, so it's only fitting that we speak to her first. And your introduction to this story, Emma, was to do with your husband, I think. Is that right?
Yes, that would be right, James. And first, I want to say thank you very much for having me on the air here this morning.
You're very welcome.
I'm an Irish national born in Northern Ireland, Irish by birth and Irish under the Good Friday Agreement. And I was walking around my whole life thinking that was my entitlement until I fell in love with an American and I had to go through immigration controls. And to my surprise, we discovered that the UK government considered me to be automatically British. And they find a creative way to block my EU rights through that. And I've been in that experience for the last 4 years. And what I think is happening here is what I and some other people in Northern Ireland have experienced is now being extended to everybody else.
I see. So dual British nationals who are British by birth will not be considered an EEA national in the UK?
Yes, and isn't that interesting? Naturalised British citizens, to say if I was French and I came over and I naturalised as a British citizen, I would still be considered an EEA or an EU national. But those that are born British and hold another EU passport, so people that are British-Irish, dual nationals, will not be considered or treated as an EEA or EU national in the United Kingdom. We will simply be treated as British.
So you lose all of your rights as a not just as an Irish citizen, of course, but as a member of a European Union member state. So all of your freedoms are surrendered upon the altar of the stroke of a governmental pen. Do you understand? I mean, are we certain that this is what's happened? Are we certain that it's deliberate? I appreciate for a lot of us this is still very early days to be contemplating the story.
Well, unfortunately, I've had to become a little bit of a unwilling expert in some of these issues.
Welcome to my world.
My own case. Yeah, well, aren't we all in that boat now with Brexit?
No, some of us are hard men of Brexit. The rest of us are on crash courses in reality. Carry on.
That's right. But yes, so Listen, I've seen this direction coming for quite some time.
Yes.
There was, I'm not the only person, for a start, the only person affected by this current policy of telling Irish nationals they're British and they can't access their EU rights. That's been going on for some time in Northern Ireland.
Right.
But we've seen a further deterioration of that position. Earlier this year in January, the Immigration Minister, Caroline Noakes, stated that as a matter of law, the people of Northern Ireland are British by birth.
Yes.
And that it is the view of the government that an international treaty such as the Belfast Good Friday Agreement cannot supersede domestic legislation, and that there is nothing in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement to stop British citizenship being imposed at birth. So, in essence, the position is you're all British, whether you like it or not, and we don't have to uphold the Good Friday Agreement if we don't want to. So I've seen that coming for some time, and last month the Immigration Minister already answered a parliamentary question and stated that NI-born Irish citizens would be exempt from applying under the settlement scheme because we're British. So we've already seen it slowly come to pass.
And I mean, in layman's terms, why can't you be both? I mean, what would they say if you said, well, why the Good Friday Agreement makes it clear I can be either, but you're forbidding me from being both?
Yeah, so that's their new system,
Yes.
So you have to remember the Good Friday Agreement says Irish or British or both.
Yes, exactly.
So the thing is with Brexit, the government had quite a complicated thing to get their heads around here because they have 1.8 million people in Northern Ireland who have a birthright entitlement to Irish citizenship.
Well, yes.
And through that, all the EU rights and benefits that stem through Irish citizenship. And I think they were thinking to themselves, well, how are we going to get around that? And they have found a creative way to block that. By putting in this stipulation that dual British nationals who are British by birth will not be considered an EEA national, that blocks all 1.8 million people in Northern Ireland from having that right to retain any EU rights.
And what about Northern Irish-born people in the Republic of Ireland?
In the Republic of Ireland, you'll be treated as an EU national. This is how the UK is
But they'll still have dual nationality. They'll be able to...
Yeah, they'll still be okay. I mean, under UK law, they're classing me as a dual national, even though I don't hold a British passport. But if I was to go to Spain, I'd be fine.
Yes, I get it. Oh, my days. Keep in touch, Emma.
It's just how the UK wants to treat people. They want to treat people...
Well, do they want to?
British.
I mean, the question I ask almost every expert contributor on matters Brexit is this just incompetence or is there some sinister master plan behind it?
As someone who's been in court for 4 years, the first 4 years of my marriage, I would have to say there has to be some kind of intent behind this. Because
and we could loosely describe it as hostile environment, couldn't we?
Well, it's certainly hostile. The families that I speak to, I mean, what they go through is really quite horrendous. And the thing is, we're talking about nationality laws, we're talking about immigration, but it's best not to get too caught up in that because what we're really talking about is identity.
Citizenship, and they are the foundation stones of identity. I need to apologise. Emma, thank you so much. Emma D'Souza, Citizens' Rights Campaigner. We will talk again. I can feel the clouds clearing, but I notice also that I'm absolutely unforgivably late for the news.